Hi, this is Maurie with Green Woman Ways, and today I wanted to share a little bit about another plant in my area that I wildcraft. Pretty much anywhere I've lived, there's always been at least some variety or multiple varieties of wild rose. And rose is, I would say, probably one of my closest plant allies. I work with it on a very regular basis. I love making tea with rose, and I love using it in a lot of different ways. So when I moved here to Central Oregon, I had to discover what was the most common native rose in this area. When I lived in the Puget Sound, kitty sneezing. When I lived in the Puget Sound, my most common wild rose was the Nootka rose. And I knew all the places to go looking for it, to harvest, and when it would bloom. And so when I moved here, we moved here in the autumn, and so the roses had already finished blooming and everything. Hips were already starting. We moved in the autumn of last year. And so I got to see what the roses were. It took me a little while, but I finally figured out what the most common native roses around here are. So not every place has as readily available resources for finding out what you have for native plants around you. For instance, in this area, it's kind of hit and miss with books. So you have to have a variety of different books to be able to cover even a majority of the plants. And even then, there's plants I came across that I was not finding things in books anywhere. So then I had to do a lot of research online as well. But thankfully, though, someone, and I'm not sure who, but kudos to them, did some sort of project here in the Central Oregon Bend area. And along our river trail, a lot of signs got put up around native plants. And so I was able to, I finally came across one day when I was walking in a new area and discovered what the most common wild rose was and had the native name and the native rose with the plaque that talks about what it was. And it's Rosa woodsii, or woodsy, depending on how you want to pronounce it. And it's called the woods rose. And so I made note of that last autumn, and then this spring I was watching them and watching them and watching them, just really eager to see them blooming. And they did, and they bloomed profusely this year. And I did a pretty big harvest. I went out, whenever I would go out for a walk, I'd have a harvest bag with me, and then I would pluck petals from a variety of different plants. One thing that when you're wildcrafting, to wildcraft mindfully and in a sacred manner, you're not going to want to pluck everything off of one plant. It's very important that you leave a lot there, and the honeybees and bumblebees in the area were a good reminder of that too, because they just love the wild rose. So they always had first dibs, and I would pick around them. So every time I went out, I would get another few handfuls of wild rose, and then I just kept adding it to a big basket that I dried. Here it's dry enough to air dry, so I was doing a lot of air drying. The thing is that this is all that's left. This tells you how much I went through. This was full, and this was picked and dried in the early summer this year, early to mid-summer. And I've already used most of it. Now I know that I need to pick a lot more. I used to supplement with purchased organic rose petals. However, here in Bend, there isn't a actual herb store like there was in Seattle, and I mean, it's not much for doing a lot of ordering online. I know I can, I just don't get around to it. So instead I keep using my wild roses, which I actually prefer working with anyway. They have a very distinctive flavor. Each one tastes a little different, and they're very different than the rose petals that you're going to be getting in like an herb store. However, obviously you have to do a lot of picking too, because they dry down. But they are very prolific here, and so you can look wherever you're at, and next spring have an idea as to where there's a lot of wild roses, and then you can look for some to pick yourself. I also love them fresh. When they're fresh, they haven't been dried, and I put them in tea as well. I blend the rose petals with a lot of different herbs for tea. One of my favorite blends is rose and mint and oat straw. That's just one I use a lot. Sometimes I'll have black or green tea and I'll add a little bit of rose petals as well. So I also use them for bringing in the energy when I'm doing any sort of intention work or spell work. I'll sprinkle them in a bath if I'm wanting to focus a little bit on self-love and just self-appreciation, and so I'll add their energy to them as well. I love combining them with rose quartz in that way for a bath. I put some rose quartz in the bath and I put rose petals in the bath. It's really lovely, and rose water. Yeah, you can tell I really love working with roses. So anyway, that was the early summer and harvest, and then in the autumn, the rose hips are just amazing this year in this area. But I like to wait until we've had some really cold temperatures. So doesn't take too long around here, and we've already had several frosts, and we've had last night, for instance, it was well below 30 degrees here. I don't know exactly what. It was actually snowing earlier. So and so I like to wait till they start to get that first frost at least, and then for picking the rose hips. And for one thing, I think they're sweeter that way. And rose hips can be really, really tart, but it does bring out a little bit of the flavor in them. And then I start picking them. And again, I just go out whenever I'm out on a walk, and I'm still not done. As long as they haven't completely shriveled up on the bush, I'm going to be able to keep picking them. So this is just a small amount that I picked the other day. They've already started to dry. I'm letting them dry a little bit before I do the seeding, except I'm going to be doing the seeding of these today. And that's because once that frost is hit, they're really, really soft. I've already tasted these guys, and they're amazing tasting. They taste very different than the commercial rose hips that you're going to be getting. They have a similar flavor that comes from the same way that the blossom will taste. And I have no idea how to describe that unless you've actually experienced the flavor of wild rose petals and tea or wild rose hips. So you'll just have to trust me that it's amazing and to try it yourself. And if you're in an area where you have a lot of rose hips growing in the wild around you, check it out and taste one. You want to usually use mostly dried or processed, but you can nibble on a little bit of them. So I'm going to share how you go through the seeding process. It is a little bit time consuming and tiny little itty bitty work that you have to do with your fingers, but you want to seed them before you use them in teas and such. Rose hips have tiny little hairs inside of them, and they can be very irritable if they get in your throat. So you're wanting to get all of the little seeds and hairs out of there, and then I'll let them dry the rest of the way. And if I get a big enough batch, sometimes I will make a syrup out of them as well, or a cordial, just like I made with the elderberry. And I did some videos on working with elderberry earlier in the year, and you can find those on both my YouTube channel and on Green Woman Ways, on the blog on Green Woman Ways. I did several posts on it. So, yeah, I'm going to start showing you the next part of this process in getting the seeds out. Okay, so you could use a small knife if you want to, but I have very clean fingers and I'm doing this for myself, so I'm actually just going to use my fingernails here to split these open. And usually take the tips off. For instance, this tail would come off, and then the tip here would come off. And then I would split them open in half, or just sort of peel them open. Usually they end up being in half. And then I start to take the seeds and the little hairs out. And it's a good idea to have something to wipe your hands on to get the little hairs off of your fingers, because as you can see, I hope you can see that, there's a bunch of little hairs on my fingers. So as you're doing them to actually wipe, which I didn't think of to begin with here, having a little dampness on the cloth is a good idea. Okay. And so I'm just going to keep doing that. I'm going to keep the seeds and the hairs off to the side. And as they dry, the hairs will kind of come off a bit more too. It's not like you're getting everything off of there, but you're wanting to get the most. And every variety of rose hip is going to have slightly different seeds, size and seed and such. So some of them will be more plump. If you have cultivated roses, like the big rugosa roses in your yard, you can also work with those. Or if you have them in your area where you know they're not being sprayed, if you have spray-free areas that you can harvest. But yeah, it's just to continue that process. You're just opening it up and pulling the seeds out, like so. And when I'm done, I will spread these out to dry more. And I usually keep an eye on them. Like I said, here I'm able to dry things fairly easily because of the dry climate, without using the dehydrator or the oven in any way. But if I want to keep an eye on them, and if I feel like they're not drying fast enough, then I will finish them off on a really low setting on a dehydrator. And do want them to be fully dry before you put them in a jar. And rose hips are just packed with vitamins, so they're one of the natural sources for vitamin C, as well as some other vitamins and nutrients. They do tend to dry pretty hard, but you can also reconstitute them just by soaking them in a little bit of water and add them to granola and anything else that you can think of that you'd like other dried fruits on. But they do need to be reconstituted a little bit when you do that. They add a nice tart flavor. Now, some of them got a little mushy. Finding that perfect balance for when you're harvesting them. But I'm pretty sure I'm going to be able to continue to harvest them for a while in this area, at least until it freezes and doesn't come above freezing for quite a while. Alright, so that just gives you an idea as to what I'm doing here. I'm wanting to keep those seeds and hairs off to the side, and then I spread them out. Yeah. So I hope you're inspired to go out and check to see what kind of wild roses you have in your area. Most places around the world do have wild rose of some sort, or at least in the United States, I can say that for certain. And they are really a joy to work with. I also like to work with them on an energetic level, and I automatically do that when I'm working with a tea. I'm connecting with the spirit of the plant and such as well. But you can also work with them by making a flower essence. You can work with them just by, in meditation even, just taking some of the petals, dried or fresh, or even some of the hips. Each one will have a little bit different energy because the plant's going to bring out different things in the various parts of itself. And you can sit and just hold them and meditate and see what comes up. See what sort of thoughts come into your mind, see what kind of images might come through, see what little whispers of wisdom that rose might have for you. And like I said, if you have, wild roses are very distinctive flavor different than cultivated roses, but if you have a lot of cultivated roses and you don't spray them, in your own yard and everything, definitely you can work with those in the same way. So you can pick the petals and you can use the rose hips, see which ones have the best flavor to you, and experiment. And happy connecting with nature by wildcrafting. Green Woman blessings to you.